It's Thursday, April 22nd. I'm Lucy Steiner.
And I'm Sam Cedar. Which of these stories will you be talking about today?
Police in Minneapolis, Minnesota just watched one of their own go down for murder. Now the federal government wants to throw open their books and make sure something like the George Floyd killing doesn't happen again. Meanwhile, Republicans looked on in horror as racial justice protests swept the country. Their response is to push for bills that would criminalize free speech in 34 states. And lastly, you may have heard the slogan, "Sex work is work." Well, it's a job that's going to get a bit safer in New York, thanks to a policy change by the Manhattan District Attorney.
You are listening to Majority FM's AM Quickie, and these are the stories you need to know.
Now the real work begins. The Justice Department is opening a sweeping investigation into policing practices in Minneapolis after a former officer was convicted in the killing of George Floyd there, Attorney General Merrick Garland announced yesterday, according to the Associated Press. The decision came a day after the former officer, Chauvin, was found guilty of murder and manslaughter in Floyd's death last May, a verdict that set off a wave of relief across the country. Floyd's death had led to months of mass protests against policing and the treatment of black people in the United States. The Justice Department was already investigating whether Chauvin and the other officers involved in Floyd's death violated his civil rights, the AP reports. But Garland said that Tuesday's verdict does not address systemic policing issues in Minneapolis. The new investigation is known as a pattern or practice, examining whether there is a pattern or practice of unconstitutional or unlawful policing. It will be a more sweeping review of the entire police department. It may result in major changes to policing in the Minnesota city. It will examine the use of force by police officers, including force used during protests, and whether the department engages in discriminatory practices. It will also look into the department's handling of misconduct allegations and its treatment of people with behavioral health issues, and will assess the department's current systems of accountability, Garland said. The AP says a public report will be issued if the department finds a pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing. The government also could bring a lawsuit against the police department, which in the past have typically ended in settlement agreements or consent decrees to force changes. This disturbing update on the reactionary forces arrayed against change comes from the New York Times. Republican legislators in Oklahoma and Iowa have passed bills granting immunity to drivers whose vehicles strike and injure protesters. A Republican proposal in Indiana would bar anyone convicted of unlawful assembly from holding state employment, including elected office. A Minnesota bill would prohibit those convicted of unlawful protesting from receiving student loans, unemployment benefits, or housing assistance. And in Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis signed legislation this week that created a harsh new level of infractions, a bill he called, quote, the strongest anti-looting, anti-rioting, pro-law enforcement piece of legislation in the country, unquote. The Times calls the measures part of a wave of new anti-protest legislation, sponsored and supported by Republicans in the 11 months since Black Lives Matter protests swept the country following the death of George Floyd. GOP lawmakers in 34 states have introduced 81 anti-protest bills during the 2021 legislative session, more than twice as many proposals as in any other year. The Florida law imposes harsher penalties for existing public disorder crimes, turning misdemeanor offenses into felonies, creating new felony offenses, and preventing defendants from being released on bail until they have appeared before a judge. The law also increases penalties for taking down monuments, including Confederate ones, making it punishable by up to 15 years in prison. Absurd. State Senator Chevron Jones calls the law, quote, racist at its core, unquote. So far, 3 bills aimed at limiting protests have been signed into law. Florida's and new laws in Arkansas and Kansas that target protesters who seek to disrupt oil pipelines. Others are likely to come soon. Clearly, Republicans don't care about free speech at all.
Hey, Majority.fm's AM Quickie is fueled by JustCoffee.coop. Just Coffee is a worker-owned coffee roaster based in Madison, Wisconsin that has sponsored the Majority Report for nearly a decade. Check out their collection of fair trade roasts, including our own Majority Report blend, and regardless of what you order, receive 10% off of your order when you use the code MAJORITY at checkout. All shipping, of course, is free. That's coupon code MAJORITY at justcoffee.coop.
Here's a welcome development. The Times reports that the Manhattan District Attorney's Office announced yesterday that it would no longer prosecute prostitution and unlicensed massage. putting one of the most high-profile law enforcement offices in the country behind the growing movement to change the criminal justice system's approach to sex work. The district attorney, Cyrus Vance Jr., asked a judge yesterday morning to dismiss 914 open cases involving prostitution and unlicensed massage, along with 5,080 cases in which the charge was loitering for the purposes of prostitution. The law that made the latter charge a crime, which had become known as the Walking While Trans law, was repealed by New York State in February. The announcement represents a substantive shift in the Manhattan DA's approach to prostitution, according to the Times. Many of the cases Vance moved to dismiss dated to the 1970s and 1980s, when New York waged a war against prostitution in an effort to clean up its image as a center of iniquity and vice. In a statement, Vance said, quote, "Criminally prosecuting prostitution does not make us safer, and too often achieves the opposite result, by further marginalizing vulnerable New Yorkers," unquote. The Times reports that the office will continue to prosecute other crimes related to prostitution, including patronizing sex workers, promoting prostitution, and sex trafficking. The office said that its policy would not stop it from bringing other charges that stem from prostitution-related arrests. That means, in effect, that the office will continue to prosecute pimps and sex traffickers, as well as people who pay for sex, without punishing the people who, for centuries, have borne the brunt of law enforcement's attention. So it's not an anything-goes libertarian fantasy, but it's still a victory for sex workers.
And now, for some quicker quickies.
Quicker Quickie.
Joe Biden yesterday called on businesses and nonprofits to give employees paid time off for COVID vaccinations, the Washington Post reports. He also touted government funding to underwrite some of the costs of that time, which is all as it should be. The Post reports that police yesterday identified the officer who fatally shot a black teenager in Columbus, Ohio. Officer Nicholas Reardon fired the shots that killed 16-year-old Makia Bryant outside a residential home on Tuesday afternoon. The girl's aunt told the Post that police body camera footage showing the girl holding a knife, quote, "doesn't show the truth of what occurred," unquote. We'll keep an eye on this one. Colorado lawmakers are considering a bill that would add gender identity and gender expression to anti-discrimination statuses, the AP reports. The bill would prohibit discrimination in employment, housing, financial services, healthcare, funeral arrangements, access to public services, education, youth services, criminal justice, and transportation. It's headed to the Senate floor for debate, then to the governor for consideration. Cheers to that. The Guardian reports that a public sector worker described as the king of absentees by the Italian press is said to have broken the national record by skipping work for 15 years. The hospital employee allegedly collected a monthly salary totaling $647,000 despite not turning up to work since 2005. Now aged 67, he faces charges of abuse of office, forgery, and aggravated extortion.
Quicker Quickie.
That's all for the AM Quickie today. Join us this afternoon on The Majority Report.